Well, hello and welcome to our Shriver Hangout for March 2016. I'm Amanda Moore. I'm the Director of Online Content and Communities at the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law. And with me today, I have two senior attorneys from Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, Robert Ballenger and Tu Tran. Hello, Rob and Tu.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, yes, afternoon there. Just barely afternoon here in Tennessee and still morning for our West Coast friends. So I always have to keep that in mind. We're all over the place during these. Well, Rob and Tu are joining me today because they are the authors of our most recent advocacy story on the clearinghouse community. You can find that at the URL below, which is povertylaw.org/clearinghouse. Their advocacy story is called Uncharted Waters: The Emergence of Low-Income Water Affordability in Philadelphia. And they're going to talk to us about Philadelphia's new income-based water rate affordability program that they worked to help get put in place. So we want to hear about that today. We also would like to hear from you. So let me take just a couple of minutes and tell you how you can be part of this conversation. That's why we do this. We want to give you the chance to talk to our authors, to talk to these advocates, share your stories with us, share your questions with us. So I know you may be watching in a couple of different ways. If you're watching us through Google itself, through the Hangout, you can use the Q&A app to send us questions. And so you can, on most screens, I know it's a little different in some browsers, you can hover the mouse over the left side of your screen and you'll see a blue Q&A icon there. You can click that and a chat box will open down the side of your screen. And you can use that to send us questions. Don't worry, your face will not appear. We will not hear your voice or anything like that. We'll just see your questions. And you can go ahead and try that out now if you want. You can just send us your name and where you're watching so we can get that communication flowing. I know some of you are watching this not through Google, but live streamed on the Shriver Center's YouTube channel. If you're watching that way, we still would love to hear from you, and you can send me an email. I have my phone here. I'll be monitoring that while we're talking. My email address is on the screen below me. It is Amanda Moore, M-O-O-R-E, at povertylaw.org. So we would love to hear from you in some fashion. All right, after today's conversation is over, we will have the video of this posted on our website, and everyone who registered today will get an email that will have a link to the recording and a link to Rob and Tu's advocacy story. So look for that within the next couple of days. Okay, with no further ado, let's talk about water in Philadelphia. Rob, I'll start with you and just go ahead and lay it out for us. Tell us about Philadelphia's new water rate program.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. I mean, we're really excited about this. We worked long and hard to get to a position where finally in November of 2015, City Council passed a new ordinance, which was later signed into law by Philadelphia's mayor, and that's now former Mayor Michael Nutter, on December 1st, 2015. So this is a recent advent. The legislation gives us some of the key pieces of what a new affordability program in Philadelphia must become. Under the legislation, I think you mentioned the terminology that it uses. It's called the Income-Based Water Rate as Affordability Program. It's a mouthful. We call it Iwrap, right? It's the acronym. And that's to be distinguished from the program we have now, which is going to be phased out, which is the Water Revenue Assistance Program, or WRAP. So they're very close in name, but if we refer to them through this presentation that way, hopefully that won't be too confusing. But going forward, affordability of water service in Philadelphia has to be based on household income. And we have a minimum of 3 federal poverty level tiers for which affordability determinations will be made. 0 to 50% of federal poverty is one tier, 50 to 100 is another, and then 100 to 150 is the third tier. The legislation allows us to create more tiers, to subdivide those tiers, and even to use a different way of determining what low income is. We could use area median income, for example. But it also tells us that for customers who are between 150 and 250% of federal poverty, those customers nonetheless are required to get a payment agreement under this legislation to give them a total overall bill that is, again, affordable based on income. So central to this, and what I think we consider so novel about this legislation for municipal water utility, is the movement toward household income-based percentage of income affordability targets. And that's what has to be established for this program to work under the bill. There's a couple of other key features here. Participants who are below 150% of federal poverty have no ongoing obligation to pay what they may owe from prior to entering the program. And in fact, they're supposed to be given an opportunity to earn forgiveness of those back balances. Finally, we've tried to dovetail in the legislation and in working with the primary sponsor, Councilwoman Maria Quinones-Sanchez, dovetail conservation into this program. We think that's essential. So participants have to agree to accept and reasonably maintain conservation efforts provided to them. It's a way of trying to control overall cost and really help promote healthy homes for these low-income families in Philadelphia. Those are the core features of the program that's going to be coming into existence, hopefully very soon in Philadelphia.
Oh, excellent. So, I'll ask you, how is the Iwrap program, how is it an improvement over what's in place or has been in place to this point, just the WRAP program?
There are huge improvements. First, I want to reiterate, we're really excited about this program, and thank you everyone for joining us and celebrating with us and being part of this discussion. There's still a lot of work ahead, but we're excited about the implementation going forward. Rob covered the improvements in affordability with the new program. There's also, the new program also provides for greater accessibility. Right now, the current program, the WRAP program, is woefully under-enrolled with only about 7,000 customers in the entire city of Philadelphia getting some kind of ongoing financial bill assistance. And you compare this with the 60 to 7,000 low-income customers enrolled in the city's gasworks bill assistance program. So there's a lot of work still to be done. The new program provides for broader eligibility standards, less stringent documentation standards, and a clear right to dispute adverse determinations of eligibility, just basic due process. Eligibility for Iwrap, the new program, Iwrap, is based on financial or special hardship. And to show financial hardship, a customer just needs to document income that's at or below 150% of the federal poverty level. There could be proxy income determinations that would be accepted. For instance, if a customer was eligible for a low-income tax agreement within the last 12 months, that information, that same city information, could be proxy income eligibility for the same customer. Expense documentation is not required under the current WRAP program. Often expense documentation that didn't even exist is being requested, and that added to the really high denial rate in the WRAP program. We have denial rates of over 40% of applications being denied. And they were being denied with impunity, with no right to appeal for a lot of these customers. But now there's under the new program, there'll be a clear right to appeal denials. Denial of initial eligibility or denial of continued eligibility. In addition, the new program provides for development of standards to stay shutoffs, to stay the water shutoff, or other enforcement like filings in municipal court or common pleas court, so that the Iwrap application can be processed without the person having to leave their home to find other housing and maybe abandon their new Iwrap application. So with this improved program, we expect to see a much lower denial rate and significantly greater enrollment.
Well, great. And I'll remind our viewers that we would love to hear your questions. So you can either use the Q&A app that's part of Google Hangouts, or you can email me at amandamore@povertylaw.org. So I want to look back. So now we see what's in place. I want to talk about how we got there. So I know with any of these big systemic changes like this, it's usually a long haul. So Rob, how did you get started doing this type of work, advocating for this program, and what were some of the steps along the way?
Yeah, so it's true with this kind of an effort. It is a long haul. We started having discussions about water indebtedness with Councilwoman Quinones Sanchez and her staff, really going back to about 2011, when the city was starting to put in place what later became our tax hardship program. So there was legislation passed that created a way of sort of systematizing tax collections and providing opportunities for low-income customers to avoid the loss of their home because of back taxes, real estate taxes. There was some discussion that because water debt, like real estate taxes, is leaned on property in Philadelphia, that we should deal with them both in one sort of overall piece of legislation. Ultimately, that wasn't the course that was chosen, but that's when the discussions started happening about, should we be doing something legislatively here, because we have a huge amount of outstanding water debt that's leaned on customers' homes. As of the end of 2014, we were talking about $200 million, 170 million of which was more than 2 years old. So we're talking about old, bad debt that is attached to customers' homes, and what do we do with that? That's sort of how things started. So we started having sort of more concerted discussions, and around the time that legislation, the real estate tax legislation, was finalized, and then on into late 2013. That legislation took about 2 years to reach final passage. So after that, we started really working on this. And Councilwoman Quinones Sanchez sponsored legislation, which was first introduced in June 2014, and it was modeled off of that tax bill. But it sort of came with the message to all stakeholders: what should we be doing here? How should we deal with low-income customers' water debt? And we, at that time, were already involved in mediating some customer service issues with the water department. And one of those issues was the existing affordability program, and how can we improve it, make substantial improvements to it. So we got this clear signal from the councilwoman that there was another forum that we could potentially be working on this in, and I think we all realized we needed to pivot and take advantage of that opportunity. So we kind of brought, for lack of a better term, the parties to the mediation into a sort of a discussion shepherded by Councilwoman Quinones Sanchez, and we began to work on our vision of a good bill. We put together comprehensive amendments, which were introduced, and they even had a hearing on them in April of 2015. Those amendments created the program soup to nuts that we wanted, and unfortunately, that wasn't the direction that was taken immediately. We kind of had to step back and then move forward. So there was a lot of that going on. The city administration came in and basically said they had some concerns, and the councilwoman chose, and I think wisely, to try to get us all to find common ground. And so amended the bill and put us in a position to work together to figure out, for the water department and for low-income advocates, what the right parameters are for legislation. We had a ambitious timeline imposed, and ultimately, we weren't able really to find that common ground without some real further guidance from the councilwoman. So that bill was again sort of amended and then reintroduced, and then toward the end of 2015, we started to run out of time, quite frankly. We got to a position where if we didn't have final legislation by November 19th of 2015, we couldn't guarantee surviving the veto. In fact, there's a pocket veto rule that would apply. So we had to work very diligently with the councilwoman and with the city administration to figure out what this legislation should be. We benefited from the expertise of our consultant, Roger Colton, in putting together a really compelling report about what we viewed as the shortcomings of one model that had been proposed and the strengths of the model that we wanted. And we think that ultimately that's sort of what led to those core provisions in the legislation that we talked about earlier, about having determinations made based on a percentage of household income. That's how we're going to say what is or is not affordable. We're going to look at a percentage of income to say this is how much on a monthly basis you can afford to pay. And that ultimately got reflected in the bill. There's some room for us to work on the design, but that final bill was passed on that last day, November 19th, 2015, to survive a potential veto. And we were really delighted to see that the mayor signed it into law on December 1st. So 17 months and some ups and downs, but ultimately we ended up with a great piece of legislation.
Oh, that's great. Well, we've had a couple of questions come in, so we'll take those. We have one that came in from my state where I am, here in Tennessee. Shelby wants to know more about the conservation efforts that you mentioned. What specific conservation measures do participants agree to as part of this?
It's part of the legislation. They have to agree to allow any conservation efforts that the water department reasonably proposes, I would say, to be put in place in their home, and they have to reasonably maintain all of those. Whether it's low flow shower heads, or if there's a program to offer more efficient water heaters or something like that, those would all have to be reasonably maintained. But there are no specific parameters. There are programs in Philadelphia that are starting to really have discussions in earnest about what we can do better in conservation. And I think as those programs sort of come into existence citywide, we've left open and sort of paved the way for anything that happens to be considered sort of a prerequisite of continuing to participate in this program.
We have one other question from Surin. Surin says that he's working on a similar issue in Boston and is interested in the funding mechanism for assistance in Philadelphia. He's asking, does it come from within the utility, and how sustainable it is?
Well, essentially other residential customers will be paying for this, or it's actually, we're in the middle of a rate case right now, which will determine the funding level for this program. So we happen to be in the middle of a rate case, and actually the implementation deadline hinges on the work of this new water rate board that's determining its first water rate case, deciding its first water rate case as we speak. I mean, it's due to make a decision in June, so in about 3 months. We'll find out the funding level of this program.
Yeah, so in Pennsylvania, the regulated utilities fund programs similar to this through either through base rates or through a surcharge on customer bills, and that would be the electric and gas companies. So rather than add a surcharge, that's the base rate for water service in Philadelphia will fund the low-income program, as it has for years and years. And base rates fund a lot of different programs in the city of Philadelphia. They fund programs that help commercial and industrial customers to receive grant money to help control stormwater. They fund a lot of different programs, and this is but one program that would be funded through rates. One of the things that I think you have to take into account when you're talking about a program like this is what's the consequence of not funding a program. And that consequence is, you can ballpark what it costs to shut someone off and then restore service. And if you do that 30,000 times in a year, which is, the approximate rate of termination in the city of Philadelphia, you're charging people a lot of money to not get service. And so when you come up with a program that allows people to keep their service on, there are a lot of reasons why your other costs go down. Your collection costs can go down, for example, because customers are able to afford to pay for service as opposed to falling behind. there are studies that show that customers who are on well-designed low-income programs actually contribute more on a net basis for the cost of utility service because they can actually afford to pay the bills that are delivered to them, which is sort of a common sense proposition. But people have actually studied it and found that it does promote the financial health of both the utility and its customers. When you're faced with the kinds of challenges that we have here in Philadelphia, where we have approximately a third of the population here is within the eligibility criteria for this program. So while there's a need to look at funding, we think there's also, quite frankly, there's a even bigger need to look at the benefits and the positive impact on utility financial health and associated benefits to our community from having people able to afford their continued water service.
We have one other question. Kathy asks if the Roger Colton report is available, and if I remember from working on the piece, it is not available because I think I had asked if we could link to it in your advocacy story. Is that something that you could send individually to someone if they got in touch with you?
Yes.
Yeah. It's just not on the web anywhere.
Yeah, I don't think it's been published anywhere publicly, but I don't think there's any restriction on providing it. I happily check with Roger, but my guess is he would be happy for it to be distributed. Okay.
Well, Kathy, I'll reply to your message afterward and give you Rob and Tu's email addresses, and everyone else, you will get their contact information as well when we send the follow-up email to this event. We just have another question come in. This one is from Amber, and she asks basically what my next question was going to be. What are the major challenges to implementing the Iwrap plan at this stage? So, Tu, I was going to ask you how things are going now and what the next steps are.
Well, the devil's going to be in the details in implementing this program. There's still a lot of detail to be worked out. I mentioned the Water Rate Board. It's going to make its decision June 7th of this year. And according to the legislation, Iwrap needs to be implemented within 15 months of that decision. So by September of 2017. So between now and then, in the meantime, the Water Rate Board needs to determine the percentage of income limitations and the number of low-income tiers. And once that's decided, we'll be working closely with the city to iron out all the other details. For instance, what does the legislation provides for earned forgiveness? That's going to be a major benefit, earned forgiveness of arrearages. That's going to be a major benefit of the Iwrap program. And the conservation measures, what's that going to entail? So there's still a lot that needs to be done, and agreeing on those details will be pretty challenging.
We have another question that's come in from Philip. Philip wants to know about due process. He wants to know what the due process mechanism is for customers who have billing or service disputes.
Okay. Well, that was one of the other issues that was addressed in the mediation that I mentioned earlier. Our view of state law in Pennsylvania is that any determination an adverse determination that the utility may make, and this being a city-owned utility, it would be subject to these requirements, that you have to have some right, some due process right, because that constitutes an appealable adjudication under local agency law. So we've been working with the city and trying to establish a really clear mechanism here. What should happen once that mechanism is implemented fully is that you have to get a decision in writing. If you have a question about your bill and you think your bill is too high and you initiate a dispute, the utility needs to give you a decision addressing your dispute. It needs to notify you of your appeal rights, and then you have to have a mechanism of having a hearing. And the hearing officer in this case, what we're hoping will happen is that these will be individuals who are not directly associated with the actual review of the bill and the rendering of that decision, but someone who is somewhat removed from the situation. beyond that, an initial decision would be made by the hearing officer, and you would have a further level of appeal rights to an independent branch of city government, either the Office of Administrative Review or the Tax Review Board, depending on the nature of the dispute. So, for example, if it was a shutoff dispute and you said you shouldn't, there was no legal grounds for a shutoff, well, that's not really a matter of amount necessarily. So maybe it would go to the Office of Administrative Review. But if you're disputing the actual bill, and the bill being something that could be essentially liened on your home, that would be a dispute as to the amount, and that would then go to the Tax Review Board. This is sort of a general description of what we think the process should be based on the mediation that we were a part of. But that too is something that really needs to be fully implemented in the city of Philadelphia, because this program provides a guarantee that if you're not allowed entry into this program, you have the right to dispute that. And that needs to be a robust process because, as Tu pointed out, we've really seen underwhelming levels of enrollment in the past, and we want to rectify that because there are a lot of people who should be enrolled in receiving bill assistance with their water in Philadelphia.
Well, we still have questions coming in. We are very near the end of our time, so if you all could stick around for a couple more minutes, I'd like to get to these questions. And I'll remind everyone, if you do have to jump off at the half hour, you will receive a link to a recording of today's event, as well as a link to Rob and Tu's article where they go into much more detail on all of this. So if your question doesn't get answered today, I would encourage you to check out their written work and also to contact them later if you have further questions. But I would like to go ahead and ask you, Kevin asks if there's money in the bill for promotion of the program, and he's wondering how ratepayers are going to find out about it and if there are time limits on enrollment.
There's no specific funding for outreach, but we would, the city's promoting it already with its rate. Actually, the city's promoting it as a successful new program that's going to be implemented soon. It actually helps them with their current water rate request to be able to promote, to announce that there's going to be a new affordability program to buffer some of the rate increase that may happen soon. There's no limitation on enrollment. There may be some limitation on funding. With the rate case, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think that the legislation does not provide for any enrollment level limit.
And I mean, I would argue that the legislation doesn't authorize a cap on enrollment, because it really boils down to whether or not you satisfy the eligibility criteria. And I think if you do, then the legislation requires that you be allowed participation in the program. I think one of the issues, and again this goes back to the mediation as well, is that the department's under an obligation to notify customers when they are threatened with shutoff or contact about a potential shutoff. Notify them of all of the means that they can avoid shutoff, and this is one of them. So, I mean, I would submit that the department has to, in providing good customer service, inform customers of these rights. I think it's vital that if you are looking to avoid a loss of service, that you be informed that one way to do so is to enroll in a special program that's really going to look at your individual household needs and what you can afford to pay, particularly when that program provides you an opportunity to get out from under the debt that may have put you in the position of being subject to shutoff.
We have a question from Lisa, and Lisa's asking this question from Flint, Michigan, which I think gives it sort of a really interesting context for this question. She asks how dependent the program is on the good intentions of the current leadership and whether it's subject to any sort of political changes as the leadership in Philadelphia changes.
Well, I think we have a law now. That's the benefit of this ordinance and having been passed into law by the prior mayor, Michael Nutter. It's on the books, and I think it's up to it's up to all the stakeholders to ensure that it is thoroughly and effectively implemented. Could the law be changed? It certainly could. Of course, I think we would obviously be involved in that, particularly if there's if it's not changing for the better. We're going to muster all of the allies that we can to oppose a change like that. I think, as Tu mentioned, the devil's in the details as far as implementation goes, and that's where there's a potential for the commitments to be expressed slightly differently. Well, how are we going to implement the earned forgiveness component? Are we going to implement it in a way that's really fair and provides customers a reasonable opportunity to get out from under that bad debt that they can probably never afford to repay anyway? Or are we going to do it in sort of a de minimis way and provide people just a little bit of relief over an extraordinarily long period that doesn't really provide the right incentives? That's where I think we have to focus and make sure that that the work that's been put in getting to this point isn't diminished going forward, and really focus on getting this right.
Just a couple more questions. One more, and this also pertains to implementation, about customer service at the utility and how you go about changing staff from sort of a mindset of being collectors to assisting customers.
That's going to be a challenge, because right now we're dealing with over 40% denial rates, and we'll have to be really heavily involved in the ongoing implementation of this work. For instance, the legislation calls for providing, like Rob said, the customer with all options available to prevent shutoff when the customer is calling, and that's going to have to be incorporated in training. We're supposed to be having quarterly meetings with the water department and water revenue on these customer service issues, and we'll be bringing these implementation issues up regularly, and we're hopeful that things will improve.
That question really gets to a structural issue in the city of Philadelphia too, which is something that is not going to get resolved through this legislation. But our water utility is actually two separate components of city government. We have the water department, which provides the water and handles the wastewater and sewer treatment, and it's responsible for all the infrastructure. And then we have the Water Revenue Bureau, which is generally the collection arm, and it's the arm of the water utility that provides for that first level of customer service. That's who people interact with when they have payment problems, is one side of the utility as opposed to the other. As Tu mentioned, this has to be part of ongoing concerted efforts to make sure that customer service improves. That is a very big challenge for us, and in this program, the last thing we want to do is have to rely on the due process mechanism to see to it that it's properly implemented. The way to do it is to actually promote good customer service, and that's something we're going to have to work on.
Well, I want to thank you all and thank everyone for these wonderful questions. I had my own questions we did not get to, but that's okay. We want to hear from you instead. A couple of the things that I had planned to ask about, and since we didn't get a chance to talk about them, I want to encourage all of you to take a look at their advocacy story on our website, povertylaw.org/clearinghouse. That's the clearinghouse community. They give tips for utilities advocates, how to get involved with this work, and they describe their unit there at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, which is the energy unit, and they have a really unique role both within their organization and in the city of Philadelphia. So I encourage you to read about that and take a look at it. Along those lines, another thing I was going to ask about was sort of how issues like what's going on in Flint, like this, get to this idea of this basic access to water, be it affordable water or clean and safe water. And that goes to something, we had a comment from Britain who writes in and wanted to ask if we would announce that there's a new national coalition on the human rights to water and sanitation that's looking to help communities struggling with water and sanitation affordability, quality, and accessibility to raise their issues at the federal level and internationally. She gives a link. It's probably a little long for me to read out, but it looks like it's the U.S. Human Rights Network. And then within that, there's a project called Water is a Human Right. So I think probably if you could Google that, you would find it. So Britton, thank you for pointing that out. That was something else I'd hoped to talk about today. So I will go ahead and make a pitch for next month's Hangout. We really appreciate all of you tuning in this month. Next month, our Hangout will be on Tuesday, April 12th, the same time as today. And we'll be looking at a really interesting structural issue within legal services. And that's the tension between a high volume practice and an impact practice. And we'll talk with the executive director and 2 work group leaders from Legal Aid of Arkansas, because they've been making this transition from a high volume program to a high impact program. Particularly, they had some big successes the past year in housing and in Medicaid. And so we will talk with them about that. I think it should be a pretty interesting discussion. They've also written an article about this. It will be our first Clearinghouse article of April that will appear on the same Clearinghouse community site. That Hangout will be again on Tuesday, April 12th at 1 o'clock Eastern and 10 o'clock Pacific. So I was going to thank Rob and Tu again, but we appear to have lost them. So fortunately, we did not lose them before the end of our conversation. I do want to thank them, and I want to thank the rest of you, and hope that you'll be able to join us again next month.